The Church of Christ, in every age, beset by change, but Spirit-led, must claim and test its heritage and keep on rising from the dead. Hopefully you remember those words because we sung them in chapel this morning. But as I was singing them, I thought how appropriate for this particular seminar, which I think will be a case of testing and claiming our heritage. Just to give a little bit of background on where this paper sits within my own research. Really, it's quite an old bit of research. It's something I started about a year ago, so I've had to come back to now. So if I'm trying to work out what I think on this topic, you may well find at points I'm thinking, what did I say? Why did I say that? And maybe you'll have more insight than me, and we'll work our way backwards. But it's an exploratory piece of research rather than a conclusive piece of research. So it's kind of open-ended. I'm putting a lot of stuff out there, trying to get the analysis as accurate as I can. But then really it's got a series of questions at the end, which I hope you will engage with. Hopefully it will prompt an interesting discussion, and I'll certainly try to finish in good time so that we can chew over some of the issues. I hope also you won't mind if I read the script. I have a 5-week-old baby at home who thinks day is night and night is day. And so my concentration is not all that it could be. So I shall be working my way through, but hopefully we'll have the opportunity to stop off at various different points if there's something that we wish to explore. So let's begin. The doctrine of sin in Eastern Orthodoxy, and hopefully you've got a handout as well. If you haven't got a handout, Stephen will be passing copies around. A few hands up at the back there. So by way of introduction, whenever we seek to understand a tradition to which we do not belong, we are in danger of oversimplification. I am not an expert in the study of Eastern Orthodoxy, and so I can only commend this study as a first exploration and an attempt to orientate myself theologically. Some of you here today will know a great deal more than me about the tradition, and I'm looking particularly in Joshua's direction, but there may well be others too. And so I look forward to adding to my own understanding through the discussion that takes place today. At the outset, we have to acknowledge that one cannot seriously believe to grasp the orthodox doctrine of sin, or of salvation, or of anything else for that matter. We only need to imagine our counterparts, perhaps in St. Vladimir's Russian Orthodox seminary, gathered round to witness the doctrine of sin in Baptist theology, yeah? Or in Protestantism, to go even further out. Eastern Orthodoxy is by no means monolithic, and even a superficial reading of the history, such as my own, indicates that. So my primary interest today is not really in the historical development of Orthodoxy. It's fairly fortunate, really, because there's a question mark on where to begin. Essentially, from the beginning. But rather, it's on the contemporary expression of Eastern Orthodox theology through the contributions of Orthodox theologians from the second half of the 20th century up to the present. One can point to a renaissance of Eastern Orthodox theology that has gathered pace with the fall of the Iron Curtain. However, the root dates back to the late 50s and the emergence of a series of eminent theological figures led by the likes of Georges Florovsky and Vladimir Lossky. Orthodoxy, post-war, began to presence itself ecumenically with renewed confidence and creativity. And in England, from the 60s onwards, the writings of Timothy Callistos Ware at Oxford offered an unrivalled academic portal into the tradition. Likewise, in Paris at the St. Sergius Theological Institute, and later in New York at St. Vladimir's Seminary, a series of Russian Orthodox thinkers, including John Meyendorff and Alexander Schmemann. Schmemann? Yeah, that's Schmemann. Thank you. Some of these surnames are a little bit difficult to get the tongue around. Presented the tradition to the West. The current generation of Eastern Orthodox theologians includes John Zizioulas, Dumitru Staniloae, Mark Irenaeus Steenberg, and John Baer. Wow, that's quite a catalogue. The degree to which these contributions reflect the real theology of Eastern Orthodox churches is naturally debatable. It's often noted that Eastern Orthodox theology has been articulated by Orthodox theologians resident in the West. Nonetheless, in the absence of any personal collections, the academic sources have to suffice for today. It should be noted, however, that the concern for authenticity has driven Orthodox theologians, much the same as their Catholic counterparts, back to the sources. A return to the Greek fathers, termed the neo-patristic synthesis, signalled an attempt to reclaim classic doctrines and to develop them sympathetically with regard to the ethos and practice of Orthodox churches. So what we find in the literature really is an aspiration for what Eastern Orthodoxy should be, perhaps, rather than what it is. Okay, now we must turn to sin. What does contemporary Eastern Orthodox theology have to say about sin? The surge of theological impetus in the last 60 years, noted above, has got two main drivers, both of which impinge upon hamartiology, the study of the doctrine of sin. The negative impetus is, as ever, definition away from Rome. In the case of hamartiology, the establishment of a position at a degree of remove from Augustinianism. I'm never going to be able to say this one now. I knew it. If I got it right the first time, I'd be fine all day. But here we go. Augustinianism. Yes. Augustinianism is ubiquitous in Orthodox thought. However, simultaneously, a positive impetus in Orthodox theology has concentrated on the development of thicker and richer weavings of core doctrine. And so this is going to give us the structure for the talk today. Essentially, we're looking at their reaction to Augustine, and then secondly, we're looking at the more positive expressions of Orthodox hamartiology. Orthodox hamartiology is bound up with the grand saga from creation to eschaton, and it's worked out in great harmony and deep resonance with the theological whole. And so we're going to address both angles in what follows. So let's start with their reaction to Augustine. The divergence between Eastern Orthodox theology and the emerging Roman Catholic consensus on a doctrine of sin can be seen as early as the writings of the very first of the Latin fathers, Tertullian. But Orthodoxy's alienation from Latin theology was slow. The centuries of unity, albeit an increasingly uneasy unity, between East and West, are reflected in Orthodox embrace and rejection of the writings of the Latins. Orthodoxy, from the historical perspective at least, affirmed the Catholic positions that developed within the 5th century and subsequently. However, contemporary Orthodox often struggle to reconcile with what they label as Western doctrines. And this is seen most clearly in Orthodox acceptance and repudiation of Augustine. On the one hand, Orthodox theologians are happy to reject a caricatured Augustinianism. On the other hand, they are uncomfortable with being labelled Pelagian by rejecting Augustine per se. And Mark Steenberg exemplifies this tension. So the first quotation we've got here is from Mark Steenberg. What has become the popular definition of original sin, i.e., a perfect original state, a fall, a transformation of nature, does establish a point of contrast with the traditional Orthodox anthropology and conception of sin, which is, in his terms, more dynamic, open-ended, developmental, and therapeutic. It thus forms an issue of ongoing disputation between Eastern and Western Christianity at large. Well, good. Otherwise, we wouldn't have any content to today's lecture. The extent to which Augustinianism, and especially Augustine's formulation of original sin, is accepted or rejected varies widely. Agreement between East and West on the doctrine of the fall extends reasonably far. Most use the terminology of original sin, although the alternative label of ancestral sin has been offered by way of distinguishing a difference. Orthodox typically accept Athanasius's argument that if disobedience had been the sole issue of primordial sin, God could as well have forgiven humanity. Repentance alone, in that case, would have sufficed. With Augustine, Orthodox would distinguish between sin as act and sin as state. Sin cannot be dissected into a series of discrete acts towards or against God, thus what Augustine called actual sins. It is also the predicament into which humanity fell, the state that prevails in human existence until Christ comes with God's salvation, and thus recovering Augustine's concept of original sin. So as to avoid the possibility that human beings could save themselves through obedience, Orthodox maintain that the primordial sin had cosmic consequences for humanity and for human relations both to God and to creation. So, the fall entails a situation which cannot be resolved from within. This is explored through a number of key metaphors. It's a wound that cannot be healed by another injured. It is a sickness that cannot be cured by another invalid. To shift the image once more, it is a captivity which cannot be overcome by a fellow prisoner. The fall entails corruption, both physical and relational, such that the path to God becomes obscured and the alternative God-forsaken reality of decay, disillusion, and death open up before the human being. Orthodox can therefore speak of the fall in a very Augustinian tone as, quote, causing the downfall of human nature, or, quote again, a sinful condition. The language of ontological change is readily employed, even if the extent of the change is reined in, and we'll see below examples of that. The image of God is, quote, obscured, but not obliterated. The world is rendered opaque to grace, resulting in a helpless situation for humanity, estranged from both creator and creation, and powerless to reverse what is apparently a one-way change. And clearly there's overlap with Western theology on these points. Moving on, however, there are distinctions to bring to light. While Orthodox affirm an ontological form, simultaneously a number of dissimilarities are notable. Firstly, the theme of judgment is less pronounced in Orthodoxy than in the other traditions. And this is so because of Orthodoxy's grand vision of salvation. At the beginning, in Orthodoxy, neither Adam nor Eve are envisaged as the complete human being, but merely as God's newly created image bearers. Orthodox maintain the tension between divine appraisal of humanity as created very good, and also the sense that the act of creation itself serves the wider and greater plan of God to bring humanity into communion and union with himself. Humanity is, therefore, an eschatological race, whose end in God is envisaged from its beginning, and whose journey is from start to finish the work of the Trinity. Now, with this in mind, the fall is instrumental, even indispensable to the economy of God's salvation. Sin is the obverse of grace, made possible precisely because of the divine risk taken at creation, whereby freedom is offered to the creature in the hope that the creature will respond. The sense of a perfected humanity at creation, common in the West, is largely absent because it is only at the end that humanity attains its goal and vocation, to be in the image of the Father. As Callistos Ware summarises, Orthodoxy, holding a less exalted view of the human state before the fall, is also less severe than the West in its view of the consequences of the fall. Adam fell not from a great height of knowledge and perfection, but from a state of undeveloped simplicity, and hence he is not to be judged too harshly for his error. In this view, Adam is culpable for his sin, and yet simultaneously he is an object of sympathy, for he was vulnerable to the devil's incitement. He is both sinner and sinned against. Adam was ill-equipped to discern truth from lie, good from evil. Without prior experiential knowledge of the same, he is tragically duped. Orthodox therefore speak of a double fall, of which human rebellion is the fruit and not the seed. Humanity has not invented sin. It pre-existed in the heavens among the angels. Angelic disobedience, exemplified in the devil's temptation of Eve, is a knowing disobedience. It is a mature rebellion, whereas the fall of humanity is couched in Genesis itself as a form of ignorance. Only after the fall were their eyes opened. Inexperience and the desire to short-circuit the process of deification temper Adam's culpability. He, along with Eve and every human descendant, is a participant in, and not the author of, sin. Secondly, the element of Augustine's doctrine deemed most controversial by Orthodox is that of inherited guilt. This is rejected, along with the notion of a biologically inherited sinfulness. For Orthodox, it is enough to say that sin is universal and the remedy is only to be found in God's grace extended through Christ, and subsequently only through the work of the Holy Spirit in the life of the believer. Debates on nature and grace do not feature prominently for the Orthodox, because both coincide when the human places itself back into relationship with the divine. More recently, Orthodox have explored possibilities for a reinterpretation of Augustine. Ware espouses a doctrine of human solidarity that proceeds from the assertion that humanity's interdependence implies a share in all human activity also. And this is our second quotation. No one falls alone, because human beings, made in the image of the Trinitarian God, are interdependent and co-inherent. No man is an island. We are members of one another. And so any action performed by any member of the human race inevitably affects all the other members. Even though we are not, in the strict sense, guilty of the sins of others, yet somehow we are always involved. And you might see in here some echoes of Western understandings of structural sin rather than individualized and personal sin. The sin is the web of deceit and of evil that we all become entangled in and become part of. And finally, and again in contrast to Augustinianism, Orthodox insist on an ongoing freedom and responsibility inherent in God's relationship to humanity. They repudiate Calvinist doctrine of total depravity or slavery of the human will. Adam's freedom was certainly a different kind of liberty because it was unhindered by direct experience of evil, But even so, his freedom remains paradigmatic for all human persons. Adam is manifestly responsible inasmuch as his freedom permitted him to remain in obedience and to reject temptation. The fall was free, in Ware's words, because it consisted in a conscious act of disobedience, a deliberate rejection of God's love, a freely chosen turning from God to self. And so he is responsible for directing the energies that are his towards the highest good. Human freedom and responsibility take a great significance in the Orthodox tradition. Here's a quote from Ware once more. God gave Adam free will, the power to choose between good and evil. It therefore rested with Adam either to accept the vocation set before him or to refuse it. Adam's fall consisted essentially in his disobedience of the will of God. He set up his own will against divine will, and so by his own act he separated himself from God. That's a pretty good summary of human freedom and responsibility. For the Orthodox, free will was the condition under which God created and called forth humanity. It is the necessary condition under which a specifically human vocation can be given. And this intention is not revoked, despite the resulting failure on the part of Adam and Eve to answer that vocation. Orthodox tend to see the fall as a premature attempt to attain to the divine. It is the failure of humanity to answer the vocation given them by God. The punishment of God in expelling Adam and Eve from Eden is the beginning of the human odyssey into the divine, which will lead in time to the incarnation. Orthodoxy, takes seriously the vocation given to humanity at the outset, and this is never withdrawn. As Sokolowski has it, the fall has rendered man inferior to his vocation, but the divine plan has not changed. And so humanity is still to be renewed in the image of its maker, and this is to be worked out by the Trinity in history through the events leading to Good Friday, Easter Sunday, and Pentecost. Augustine insists on the inability to will freely after the fall and thus to respond to God, following Paul's metaphor of spiritual death in Ephesians 2, verse 1. But by contrast, Orthodoxy insists that the damage done was serious but not total. Here we have Timothy Ware yet again. The image of God is distorted by sin, but never destroyed. In the words of a hymn sung by Orthodox at the funeral service, I am the image of your inexpressible glory, even though I bear the wounds of sin. And because we still retain the image of God, we still retain free will, although sin restricts its scope. In the extreme, Augustinianism has been diametrically opposed. For example, in the 8th century, John of Damascus explicitly states that humanity is unsinful by nature and free in its will. And this is necessary, in his view, for human power to be freely turned to God, because nothing forced, he says, can be virtuous. However, most Orthodox would follow the view that the will is limited both by the finitude of the human condition and by the distortion of human desire. Human choice is, for Ware, restricted but not destroyed. Some, for example Sokolowski, are careful to close out the possibility of Pelagianism by qualifying human freedom with its captivity to sin. Here's a quotation from him. Adam did not fulfill his vocation. He was unable to attain to union with God and the deification of the created order. That which he failed to realize when he used the fullness of his liberty became impossible to him from the moment at which he willingly became the slave of an external power. It's interesting, isn't it, that Augustinian language starts to come back through in this Orthodox theologian's writing. And this is really illustrative of Orthodoxy's awkward relation to Augustine. He is blessed in one breath, and he is rebuked in the next, such that the Orthodox do not embrace a traditional form of original sin, but a qualified version of the same. A more detailed appraisal will be possible once we've looked at the positive impetus of Orthodox thought, and that's what we're going to turn to in the next section. We'll take a momentary pause, though. Are there any questions so far? Any questions or comments or clarifications? You're hanging on in there? Yep, this stuff is fairly dense, for which I apologise, but hopefully in the discussion we'll start to unravel the density. Yes?
Well, you talked about the fall on simplicity, not on perfection.
Yep.
Is that about ignorance rather than perfection? Can you unpack that a little bit?
Well, one strand of thinking on this topic has Adam and Eve as children in Eden. So it's not simply that they are ignorant, it's that they are undeveloped as well, or underdeveloped, or in a process of development, for which the fall is necessary, in as much as it's the choice that they discover they have to make, either to move towards God or against God, with his will or against his will. Does that help? Yep.
Roland, sorry. Your second paragraph, your term co-inherent. Could you define to me?
Yeah, interdependent in the sense of relying upon each other in many ways, but co-inherent is a bit more deep than that, isn't it? It means that we can only hold together through each other, effectively. It follows it up immediately with the illustration, no man is an island. I think that's meant to illustrate that point. It's not just that we depend on each other, it's actually without one another, everything falls apart. That which we know as life is dependent on community, essentially. You've all gone very silent now, so I guess it's time to resume. I think we needed to come up for air, though, didn't we? Okay, let's look at the next section, which is a slightly shorter section on the positive Orthodox vision. Death and deification. Deification, or theosis, is widely recognised as a definitively Orthodox doctrine. You find plenty of books on it in the library. Yet to understand it, one must appreciate that Eastern Orthodoxy's approach to the biblical narrative is to read from the end of the story to the beginning. And for this reason, the effect of sin tends to be viewed within the context of full restoration in the eschaton. Though important, the personal confrontation with sin takes second place to the mystical communion with God in prayer. Drawing on early Alexandrian theology, the question recurs as to how the dying, decaying human may attain to the life of God. The focus, therefore, is more on the solution than the problem, more on the overcoming of corruption than the power and triumph of sin in the here and now. A key contrast with Western teaching is the emphasis on death rather than moral decline as the legacy of the fall. Here's Meyendorff, and his quotation is reproduced for you as well. There is a consensus in Greek patristic and Byzantine traditions in identifying the inheritance of the fall as an inheritance essentially of mortality rather than sinfulness. Sinfulness being merely a consequence of mortality. Now, this approach may appear to be non-linear, perhaps even an inversion of the Genesis narrative. However, the distinction is of huge significance. Identifying human plight with mortality rather than depravity leads to a soteriology characterized primarily by deification rather than justification. Simply put, dealing with the earthly manifestation of sin is not the end of God's dealing with humanity. As Sokolowski has it, after the fall, human history is a long shipwreck awaiting rescue, but the port of salvation is not the goal. It is the possibility for the shipwrecked person to resume his journey whose sole goal is union with God. For the Orthodox, primordial sin has resulted in corruption as a direct consequence of breaking communion with God. Gregory of Nyssa says, quote, "Corruption and decomposition are truly the falling away from him who truly exists." In other words, you remove yourself from God and you begin to die and to decay. This is, on the devil's part then, a deliberate attempt to destroy the work of God. He is, after all, in the words of John, a murderer, anthropotokos, from the beginning. As such, he entices humanity into removing itself from the source of life through disobedience. They become dying beings. Yet this tragedy is not beyond the foresight of God. Though the devil intends destruction, God has a greater, all-encompassing restoration. Death itself becomes instrumental, for God's punishment is not vindictive, but a chastisement. For where, quote, "death is not the end of life, but the beginning of its renewal. It serves to limit the spread of evil, to encourage penitence. The seemingly inevitable dissolution of humanity is, at length, God's mercy, exposing the finitude of existence without him in order to turn his creature back to eternity with him." In the writings of Sokolowski, God acts in this manner, for his punishment is pedagogy. Sokolowski says, "Better that man dies, that is to say, is excluded from the tree of life, than his monstrous condition be made eternal. His finitude would make repentance well up within him. Therefore sin opens up the drama of redemption." And again, in the fourth quotation on your handout, this is Sokolowski once more. "The curse of death has never been a judgment of God. It was the punishment of a loving father, not the obtuse anger of a tyrant. Its character was educative and restorative. It prevented the perpetuation of an estranged life. It not only put a limit to the decomposition of our nature, but by the anguish of finitude helped man to become alive to his condition and to turn to God." So death here is the spur for humanity to seek after God. I was thinking about this just as I was rereading my notes this morning. It seems to me that in Eastern Orthodoxy, this idea of death as a kind of an instrument of God to turn the disobedient back to obedience, it's performing a very similar function to the law in Paul, particularly in Romans. The law is there as an educator. It's there in order to impose a limit on human evil, and is there to bring them back, the instrument of God. Anyway, that was just an aside that occurred to me as I was going through the notes today. Ultimately, the alienation between the creature and the creator is not a moral problem and goes beyond a matter of crime and punishment. The issue for Orthodox is that humanity is a dying race precisely because they have abandoned God and his eternity. And in this sense, sin, once acknowledged, is humanity's first realization of the economy of salvation. Sin, though manifest in human wrongdoing, is most poignantly manifest in death and decay. For Dumitru Staniloae, quote, "Sin continues to stand in relation to eternity and to yearn after it." This view from heaven is characteristically orthodox. As John Zizioulas puts it, for death to be overcome, the created has to come into relationship with the uncreated and source its life from it. Orthodox interest in personal and corporate communion with God overrides the categories of law, justification, and penal substitution, whereas the West espoused a forensic theological anthropology, the East tended towards mysticism. Here's a summary from Stephen Thomas. Orthodoxy teaches that Christ offered the life-giving and unslain sacrifice for all people. There was no debt required by God to appease his wrath or satisfy justice, and there is no transaction between the Father and Son to effect human salvation. Wow, there's some controversial statements. In Orthodox soteriology, God goes far beyond justice. His mercy is paramount. And it's interesting when we think about biblical texts in the Old Testament repeated by Jesus that mercy triumphs over judgment, which is actually reflected, the mercy or the judgment in our own theology. Rather than a concentration on the result of sin in terms of the spread of sinfulness and moral theology, the focus of Orthodox thinking is on death and mortality. Union with God requires that humanity be transformed into the image of God, which was its goal from the start. And so the emphasis is on finding the way back to God, a redirection from the path that leads to death, discovering that death itself is opposed to God and God to death. Okay, once again, we've reached the end of the section. How are we doing for time? I've got one excursus that we could go to. Yeah? Shall we go for it? A little excursus. This is a kind of corollary of the main discussion. We're just talking about sin and the church. The status of the visible church is higher in Eastern Orthodoxy than in the Western traditions, especially Protestantism. Zizioulas criticises the latter as follows. If the identity of the church is derived from the community itself rather than from Christ, it would of course be scandalous to say that the church is holy. The first things that Protestants tend to say about the church is that it is sinful, as though it was sin that most fundamentally constitutes the being of the church. By contrast, Orthodox view the earthly church from the perspective of the eschatological church, which has profound implications for its sense of calling. The church is the church of the sinless Christ. She is his bride and will be spotless one day, sanctified by him. And so Ware says this: the church on earth exists in a state of tension. It is already the body of Christ, and thus perfect and sinless. And yet, since its members are imperfect and sinful, it must continually become what it is. But human sin cannot affect the essential nature of the church. We must not say that because Christians on earth sin and are imperfect, therefore the church sins and is imperfect. For the church, even on earth, is a thing of heaven and cannot sin. As a thing of heaven, the church, as the world presence of Christ, sanctifies the sinful rather than being corrupted by them. Salvation as a movement towards communion with God cannot be separate from communion with others as church. Right, let's sum up. We're coming into the home straight now, and it's going to be over to you in a moment. Eastern Orthodox theology has been described as realized eschatology. Its understanding of sin and salvation revolve around the mystical desire to commune with God and to enter into his life. In fact, Eastern Orthodox theology is characterized by prayer. It's not so much a system to understand as a means to articulate prayer and worship. But as such, sin is irrational. It's against nature, for it is opposed to both creation and its creator. Sin is the refusal to live within the economy of salvation, with the hope of communion and union with God. Though sin has many consequences, not least in the moral sphere, the primary consequence is the loss of God himself, and with that, the loss of life. Such a loss was permanent, attributed to the devil's overpowering influence, rendering humanity inert to the inner aspect of God's grace. But all this was overturned in the incarnation, when Christ's obedience, culminating on the cross, became the means by which the Spirit could be poured out on humanity, restoring them in the image of God. Now, for the post-Pentecost church, sin is doubly irrational. It is a spent force that is factored out in the coming eternity. So now let's think about how to evaluate the results of this study. Eastern Orthodox hamartiology might seem to offer an attractive alternative to the grim teachings of Calvin and his cohort. It overcomes, perhaps, the paralysing effect of self-loathing and despair known well within Protestant circles. However, the categories of judgment, righteousness and atonement, to name but three, are conspicuous by their absence. We might well ask where our own theology is headed, as Protestants, as Baptists. Seems to me that the general cultural mood within our society is that Western theologies and Western religions are inauthentic, and that Eastern religions and theologies are therefore more authentic. Thus, there is a kind of natural tide which is flowing, taking us eastward in our thinking. We might therefore question whether Orthodox theology is a kind of vision of our future. Now, for some, the answer will be a resounding no, particularly with the idea of the biblical category of law simply being airbrushed out of the picture, lest the cross itself be removed from the heart of the gospel. Certainly the manner in which Orthodox abstract from present experience to the eschaton is inevitably marked with a withdrawal from the particulars of our present. This is so because the Western traditions generally locate theology in history, thus in revelation, thus in theological discourse. But the East has located theology in prayer, in philosophical speculation, and in asceticism. Some will no doubt feel a sense of unreality about Eastern Orthodoxy. The anthropology too optimistic, too otherworldly to be persuasive. It is a theology of yearning rather than dealing with present realities. Comparatively, Western theology is not just familiar, it is definitively pragmatic. Others, however, may find in Eastern Orthodox theology a rather penetrating and awkward critique of Western theology, and a prompt to reevaluate much of what is taken for granted in our tradition. The Church of Christ in every age, beset by change but Spirit-led, must claim and test its heritage and keep on rising from the dead. Let the debate begin.
Okay, thanks ever so much, Roland. I think it's fascinating to consider a very familiar topic like sin, from a perspective that some of us might not be particularly familiar with. So thanks ever so much. I actually found it quite, the Orthodox teaching as you were describing it on sin, I actually found a lot of it quite refreshing, quite edifying and life-giving as well. But we'll see what other people think. Does anyone have any questions for Roland? Trevor?
Yes, thank you very much, Roland. You've been confirming for me something I already came across through reading Greek Orthodox writers in English. The idea that death, physical death, is the punishment for the fall. Is this tied in to a necessary creationist viewpoint, rather than a viewpoint which allows for evolution and things like that? Because I find that a problem with Eastern Orthodoxy, if that is really the case. And the other thing is, sinfulness is a consequence of mortality. What about the wages of sin?
Yeah. Yep, the wages of sin is death. Romans 3:23. Yeah. On the first one, I have to admit I don't really know, because I haven't explored where Orthodox sit in regard to the creation narrative, and whether it is a literal account or not, whether we have to be six-day creationists. My instinct, without knowing, would be that they don't necessarily accept it as literal. But maybe Joshua knows more than me on that topic. But
it's a parable of man's self-estrangement from divine absolute. I think more than a literal reason.
Yeah.
So the idea that death in Genesis 2 refers to spiritual death, and in the day in which you eat of the fruit, you shall die. And Adam and Eve died spiritually. That is nowhere to be found.
No, I think that is where Eastern Orthodoxy goes, with this idea that we're born free in that sense. We're born with the opportunity to either respond to God and His revelation or to reject it. It means that in our rejecting of it, we enter into spiritual death. As soon as we let go of the call of God in our lives, we begin to dissolve, to go back to the dust from which we came. So that is spiritual death. It's the physical aspect of it is delayed, but the spiritual aspect of it is instantaneous, I think.
Thank you.
And the other one was about, sorry, you have to remind me now. Wages of sin is death, yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of texts that we can bring to bear on Orthodox theology from our love of Romans and from our centrality of it at the heart of all doctrine. And yeah, there are questions that no doubt theologians have a go at answering, but I haven't worked out exactly how they deal with it.
But do you not think that that's a problem, though, Ron, that we sometimes become so fixated on legalistic understandings of sin, soteriology, salvation, etc. And particularly this model of penal substitutionary atonement has been absolutely central to Western evangelical understandings of salvation. Do you not think that there's something of real merit and value to this Orthodox re-evaluation or perhaps even deconstruction of some of these overly Calvinistic, what Calvin actually wrote and what his later interpreters said that he wrote is a different issue. But have we not become narrowly fixated, and is this approach to sin not a kind of a breath of fresh air, if you like, a very refreshing approach?
Yes, absolutely.
Understanding of sin in its cosmic dimensions.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not just, as I say, the work of Eastern Orthodox theologians working in the West and thus coming up with a kind of critical theology. It is going back to the work of the Greek fathers. And most of you will know that my research topic is the doctrine of sin in Irenaeus. So we're going back now to the end of the 2nd century. So it's before the great divisions of the church. So looking into a kind of a root theology that goes behind Augustine as well, in terms of working out what was actually proclaimed, what was actually preached about sin, in the early church. And we find that it is not a carbon copy of the Western theology that we've inherited as Baptists. It is different, and in many senses it resembles what's being talked about here. And in fact, RNS is a key source amongst others.
So it's different. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's wrong.
It doesn't, no, but by no means. It's about reclaiming our heritage. I'm one that believes that without seeking to become Eastern Orthodox and start attending very, very dark church services that are sort of covered in iconography and getting a long beard and a hat, that's not. I'm sorry if I've trivialised anything there, but you get what I mean. I don't necessarily want to adapt myself fully to that tradition, but I want that tradition to inform my own theological reflection, because it is part of our heritage. It's part of our root.
Any more questions, Andy?
Thanks. It really helps me, although this is a really simplistic question. So,
I like simple.
Is that all is about corruption of mortality and dying, and that corruption of morality is a consequence of that. And I wonder how they make the link, because does necessarily corruption of mortality result from, moral corruption? That doesn't necessarily follow from physical corruption.
Yeah, I think the idea is that once you realise that life is finite, once you realise your own limitations, once you realise that resources are scarce and so on, and that life is hard and it can be tooth and claw, that's what leads to sin in that sense. The moral deviance follows out from that. Once you let go of God, once you've started to disintegrate spiritually, once you've let go of sort of the root of your life, that is when moral failure proceeds. Yeah. So vertical sin precedes horizontal sin, if you want to look at it that way. Yeah.
Because it's spiritual corruption as well as physical.
Yeah. But what we're saying is that the vertical precedes the horizontal. Read the Genesis account that way. Genesis 3 is the rebellion against God. It is the vertical sin, isn't it? But Genesis 4 is when Cain and Abel got murder suddenly. So vertical sin first, then horizontal sin as the consequence of that.
Okay, any more questions?
Can I just ask you to clarify one particular point, your excursion about sin in the church?
Yeah.
Roski's view is that Protestant view is the church, you start with the statement that the church is sinful.
Yep. That was Zizuias, actually.
Is this one Zizuias? Yeah, that seems to be an odd analysis of Protestant and Western doctrine of the church. Is unthought. What do you comment on that?
Well, I think it depends which Protestant churches you go to.
Yeah.
I certainly wouldn't say that churches that I've gone to have been obsessed with sin, or have viewed that as the kind of the fundamental constitution of the church is that we are sinful, But I can think of contexts where that might be true. I'd have to say that I think he's looking to the extremes to find that.
But I mean, you take great creeds, one holy Catholic apostolic. Well, how does that figure in that discussion? The scriptural thing of the church is being in Christ, and you believe in that. And so, it's not true. This just seems an odd analysis, an odd conclusion to draw an analysis.
Yeah, I mean, Luther's doctrine was that the church is constituted of individuals who are both sinners and justified at the same time. So it's always been there with that double there. I think the question is which one dominates. Is our thinking about church dominated by the fact that we're sinful beings, or is it dominated by the fact that we're looking towards our future as perfected beings? We look from the present to the pragmatic dimension, or do we look to the future at the eschatological? This is where we're going, so we're going to become what we are. Yeah? That's the distinction, yeah.
Well, thank you. My knowledge is limited to an article last year's Scottish Journal Theology about Orthodox theology, intrigued. But if they're right, they were suggesting that the Orthodox practice is almost limited to the Mass, the Eucharist. There's no active discipleship. Now, are there parallels with your typecast picture of the Catholic Church where you do what you want, you confess your sins? And if so, is there something fundamental about how they treat the Mass and Eucharist in terms of their understanding of sin?
That's a really good question. As I said, I didn't focus on the historical or the sort of practicing dimensions, but I don't know, Joshua, if you've got any insight into that. I find it hard to believe that that anything is just down to just merely attending Mass.
Well, with Orthodox theological practice, everything begins and ends with theosis, with participation in divine nature. So, discipleship, the object and the point of departure for all Orthodox thinking and practice about discipleship is about theosis, about participating in divine nature.
And it is a theology of the way as well, isn't it? This is what Timothy Callistos Ware speaks about, and he's written about at length, the Orthodox way. So you've got this very strong emphasis on it not just being a thing that you do. It is your entire life that matters. Your life led in the presence of God, with a heightened sense of God being with you in every moment of the day. In the West, just to give another characterization, Jesus says that he's the way, the truth, and the life. Right? In the West, we tend to focus on the truth aspect of it, whereas I think in the East, it's more about the way and the life aspects of it. So I think definitely discipleship, but perhaps with a kind of different slant on it. Less about the kind of intellectual knowing of doctrines, and more about lived stuff.
The practice of the ordinary believer, my understanding is that the message of Orthodoxy is the divine liturgy on Sunday, 2 or 3 hours. And that is the thing. There's no Bible classes, discipleship classes, baptism preparation, all this stuff we do, house groups. At least not in the kind of traditional, maybe in some areas of the West, you might have that as well. But theoretically, the divine liturgy is the place, and within the liturgy, through the great entrance, the little entrance, the great entrance, the gospel, the logos, you are combined, joined in and united. That is the way. He is the way. Christ is the way. He is the one who draws you in, pulls you up. So what an ordinary Orthodox believer does on a day-to-day basis, I think, is very risky indeed. I mean, you might be your icon in the corner, say your prayer to the saints, but I don't think there's any kind of sense of what we would call discipleship, to quiet time, daily devotion, scripture, those, all that stuff.
And likewise, this kind of sense of, is there evangelism within Eastern Orthodoxy as well, which is the big question for me, because I'm reading Irenaeus as one who is very much the evangelist, the preacher, the one who is seeking to bring the truth persuasively to people who've not yet accepted Christ. And I wonder that is that the case within Orthodoxy, which has had a much more checkered history? Politically, it's been far more suppressed and challenged than perhaps Christendom. But no, go on.
I once overheard a young man in the Orthodox Church approach the priest who I was with and knew him. This young fellow came up and engaged the priest in conversation. Basically, what he said, he was a seeker. He was probably 20-year-old or something like that. Obviously, quite an intelligent, thoughtful young man. And he said, the priest, Father John, what would I do if I wanted to become a member of the Orthodox Church? And of course, to me, this was a marvellous opportunity. Preach the gospel, let's have a chat, read the booklet, read the Bible. That's an evangelist in me. And I was totally astonished to discover him completely, apparently uninterested. And he simply said to this boy, young man, well, do you want to love God? And he said, obviously yes, I couldn't really overhear him. And then the advice from the priest was, come to the liturgy. That was the evangelism, come to the liturgy. I was astonished that totally reflects what you just said. That's the way they approach, the way you come into it, sort of experience the liturgy.
Yeah.
Mr. Lawrence, isn't it actually true that the Eastern Eucharist used to include a particular section for pre-baptismal individuals, and that section is completely omitted in today's practice?
I have no idea. It sounds like a great theory. Do you know any more about it?
Yes, it is true.
Right. And what do you think is the significance of that?
Well, I think one can make certain inferences from that, particularly in the role of baptism and in instruction within that church.
That they've been sidelined? That they've been sidelined for that reason? Or?
They've been now omitted.
Yeah, Andrew.
Linking it to baptism, John Smythe, very early on, the creation of Baptist churches, had this debate with Richard Clifton about original sin. And his key argument, moving away from infant baptism, was that Christ was the new Adam. So after Christ, we have a new humanity, so children aren't born with the original sin of Augustine. What would the Eastern Orthodox do with the language of Christ as the new Adam, with how they're taking those early Genesis chapters? What would that mean to them?
I don't know. I mean, the first question that comes to my mind is, what do Eastern Orthodox do about baptism? And I'm assuming that they're Paedobaptists. I would be right there, wouldn't I? So that's interesting. You know, what does baptism symbolise if you don't believe that the child has got any guilt to be cleansed of? They might have the consequences of the fall to deal with. They might be part of the cosmic dislocation, and so baptism might have an effect there. But anyway, that's my thought. What's your thought again? Your thought was about
the concept of the new Adam in this. If the result of the fall is death rather than sin, Christ is the new Adam, that Christ still died. I know he's resurrected and opens the resurrection for all of us, but Christ still died. So is his death what makes him the new Adam?
I'm not sure about that. I don't know that I came across any other Eastern Orthodox that made the link between Christ and Adam, except through the readings that I've done with Irenaeus. And he certainly does pick up on that. And in fact, it's something that he takes from Paul and really runs with, and is kind of it's part of his love of making parallels and analogies within Scripture to aid understanding. So it is there, and it is built on, but Christ being the new Adam because he died, I don't know. Irenaeus' idea is that Christ recapitulates every aspect of our human life and living, including death. So he redeems death by dying. So there's that idea there, but I don't know if that's the criteria for him. I mean, I think you know, it's a whole holistic thing, you know, rather than just a in the atonement thing. I think what Christ does that makes him the new Adam is that he lives his entire life obedient to God, not just that final act of obedience, which is going to the cross, but his entire life lived in obedience from the cradle to the cross. I think that is more important than simply the cross by itself as an act of atonement.
Any more questions? Yes.
going back to something you touched on earlier, and sort of the practical implications, how much, if any, evangelistic preaching is there in Eastern Orthodoxy? And secondly, related to that, if there is, to what extent is sin used, as in sort of typical of traditional, very traditional Western evangelism?
It's a great question to ask, and I don't know. Unfortunately, I've got the academic sources in front of me. I haven't spent time in those particular churches, and I think it would be a great thing to do that and to learn more of that. I'm sorry, I just don't know. But we've had an inkling that possibly the Eastern Orthodox might not be orientated towards evangelism in a way that seems natural to us.
I just wondered, you see, if there was therefore a sort of a tradition of assuming faith and hence building on that and building on and increasing our relationship with Jesus, as you were mentioning earlier, whether that was in practice the emphasis rather than a sort of our Western tradition of assuming that people who in the service are not necessarily believers.
Yeah. Well, Orthodoxy begins in a Christendom, doesn't it? It begins in the Christendom of the East, which ends with the Byzantine Empire falling in 1453 or whenever it is, and then consists largely of national churches thereafter. So there is an idea of Christendom and of belonging to the national church, and nationalism being wound up with Eastern Orthodoxy. This is where your writing comes in, isn't it, with the situation in Eastern Europe at the moment, and how the theological and political are really tied in.
Thanks, Peter. Stephen has a question.
Yeah, I think just in response to Peter, I think the answer is no. There isn't very much evangelistic preaching, certainly as we would know it. I'll just say this because I was privileged to be involved last year in a day's dialogue between Orthodox and evangelical theologians on the subject of preaching. And I mean, two things came out of that. One was that, from the Orthodox participants themselves, they acknowledged that preaching generally was something which had perhaps taken a back seat and was not, within the 2 or 3 hours or whatever of the liturgy, was not given the priority that perhaps it deserved. So this came from them. But equally, these participants who, yes, they are British or American Orthodox rather than actually ethnically Greek or Russian or whatever, but they are very committed to a rediscovery of the ministry of preaching. But I would think that is very much, as Roland was saying, within the Christendom model. So you preach to those who are there within the liturgy, who are the baptized, etc. And it's about enabling them to grow into God. So I think that would be my perspective on that. Can I ask a different question? Well, it's not so much a question, but just observing that what you said about Romans once or twice set me thinking about all the bits of Romans that you could read and say, well, yes, you can see an Orthodox view coming into that. And often you look at some key biblical texts and you see that the emphases of different parts of the church are actually there. So yes, you've got justification and elements like judgment, the wages of sin, the wrath of God. They're all there, but chapter 1, you've got human responsibility, human accountability. We ought to have known God through the creation, but we didn't respond. And that still continues. You've got the emphasis on the glory of God. Chapter 3, we lack the glory of God, but chapter 8, those whom he called, he also justified. Those whom he justified, he also glorified.
Yeah.
You've also in chapter 8 got the cosmic dimension, the renewal of all creation. And in chapter 11, you've got this great climax. God has shut up all under sin, that he might have mercy upon all. Mercy in the end, triumphing over judgment. So I think it's a very interesting
exercise in looking at different traditions' interpretation of Scripture and seeing how actually, one group hasn't got it all, hasn't captured it all. And somehow Scripture often captures some of the different emphases that have historically driven different groups of Christians apart.
Yeah, and we've got something to unite around, therefore. That's what's really exciting.
Any more questions, yes?
Yeah, there's kind of Trevor asked me a question a while ago about whether is it a priest-centered church? And I said to my wife, she was in Greece for 7 years. Yes, it was. Certainly in Greek Orthodox. But it prompts the question to me, what constitutes the church? From the little I've read so far, that the church decisions are all made by the patriarchate.
Yep.
Patriarchates.
Yes.
Is there any voice for the laity, and how do they define a congregation? Is it people or the church locally? Is it that people just turn up, or is there a membership, or do you not know?
I've got no idea. I mean, I'm with you. I think I've worked out enough about governance to work out that it's top down rather than bottom up. But beyond that, I don't know anymore. I don't know how it's organised locally. I know that it's fragmented. I mean, you've got about 6 patriarchs of various different kinds knocking around for some cities. So it's, it is a strange thing.
My observation is, you're absolutely right, it's definitely priest-run, but it's, my perception is that it's the whole thing is connected with this theosis, the deification, which begins with priests and men, and then women, and the laity, men laity, women laity, and then the animals, and then the natural creation and the rocks and so on. So that the whole of creation is being gathered into things, and it's incredibly hierarchical. So you have a big problem with the place of women in the church and so on. Much more difficult, probably even for the Catholics in that respect, because of that whole hierarchical way in which it's viewed. So that's right, I'm sure. The laity don't have anyway like, say, power as the priesthood.
And that's interesting, isn't it? Because you don't get then this kind of eschatological sense. It's not as if it's looking at from the end where we're all, there is no male or female and then there's no slave or free. It's very much dealing with a present reality and insisting on its stability rather than it being drawn really any further forward.
Yeah, I mean, the reason for the question really was when you were talking about sin and the church, where are the boundaries, for what constitutes, if you like, the antithesis of Western view or alleged view of the sinfulness of the church and the Eastern Orthodox approach, which is different. And that's really why I asked the question.
Yeah, I think it's helpful possibly to widen the discussion to include aspects of Orthodox theology in general, Orthodox ecclesiology. But I think, in fairness to Roland, I think we need to try to ask questions relating to the specific subject, which was about Eastern Orthodox understandings of sin. If I can just come back to you on this point, I've got here an encyclopedia of Orthodox theology. I've opened the page up to the chapter on sin. And I find it fascinating that insofar as some statements could almost have been written by, this is written by Orthodox theologians, but some of it could almost have been written about by Western evangelicals, sin as a kind of falling away from God, existential rupture. But then it refers to sin, really interesting, sin as a necessary part of humankind's restitution and reabsorption into the divine nature, which I find is something really fascinating. And Stephen was referring to Romans earlier about how some of the aspects of Orthodox understandings of sin correspond to Paul's epistle to the Romans. I'm thinking particularly of, is it Romans 4 or 5, where Paul says that the penalty incurred by the trespass of sin is not to be compared to the grace that flows from the abundance of Christ, or words to that effect, something like that. It seems that in Orthodox theology there's almost this understanding of sin as not just something inevitable, but actually something necessary to redemption itself. It's a really fascinating dialectic.
That's the instrumentality of sin, and it's definitely there. It's there in Irenaeus. It's that God puts human beings into a position where evil is there. You know, it's the old question of who let that serpent in the garden. You know, it was there. There was something there that humanity had to deal with, had to wrestle with, that opened up possibilities of obedience or disobedience. You know, the framework was there. Why is it there? There has to be some kind of instrumentality within God deciding to set things up that way. But the flip side of it is then, well, where is this evil coming from? Where is this influence coming from? And if you remove it to the sort of heavenly realm and to the angels, you're sort of protecting yourself in one way, but you're not really answering the question, because, you know, where does it have its origin? Where does it come from? Why is God allowing this? Is God not the author of evil? If we go that far,
Yes, in the books I've been looking at, there's this whole question of evil is blamed on the devil. It was Lucifer's fault, and you know, I did wonder, are they superlapsarians or what?
There's a danger that you end up collapsing into dualism. At the end of the day, that evil is somehow always out there, pre-existence, and the choice that we're faced with our human responsibility is a choice between good and evil, which are both eternal in that sense. We don't, you know, that's going a lot further than I would wish to go personally.
But Orthodoxy doesn't say that either. It doesn't believe in the pre-existence of sin before creation or anything like that. I think what is emphasised is, to refer back to the encyclopedia again, it refers to the universality of fallenness, and actually this universality being a condition of universal cosmic redemption at the same time. So if the fall hadn't been universal in its scope, then there wouldn't have been the same sort of scope for Christ's redemption on a cosmic universal scale. So I wouldn't say that Eastern Orthodoxy posits a dualism in that sense. I don't know if that's...
No, I wouldn't pin that on them either. But I think you do get, in Eastern Orthodoxy, you do get this sort of Greek philosophical influence that does wrestle with those type of questions and possibly goes, you know, a lot closer to that sort of ancient Greek mindset within their theological frameworks. I also think that you've got this kind of missional thing going on as well. You know, that when Paul's writing, you know, he's writing as missionary to the Gentiles, but Romans is laced with this angst that the Jews should take hold of it too, and it's really a book that's written to both sides. In Irenaeus, though, I think the mission has sort of shifted. It's not so much a mission to the Jews anymore. It's a mission to the Gentile world, to the Latins, and even to the Celts, perhaps. So that's controversial. But the point is that the category of law is not as significant for those hearers, and therefore is it only natural that the human plight is recouched in terms of mortality, rather than judgment for not adhering to a law which they never had in the first place.
Any further questions?
More so clarification. If it's right that the Orthodox understanding of creation is in terms of people who are almost children, not yet matured, that are given free will, then almost inevitably the implication is that death is an essential part of God's creation, because humans is created by immature, even with free will, and the best case scenario they get it wrong, and therefore God isn't, as it were, saying, I'm going to create you so it happens, he's saying, I'm death going to be part of the package. Is that fair?
That's interesting. I don't think that necessarily follows, but yes, this idea of death being a limiter, that's part of their thinking, isn't it? Trying to see death as something which God imposes as a mercy, such that evil human beings do not prolong their existence. But the whole idea of theosis and Orthodox interpretation of eternal life is not that, you know, we get worse and worse and worse and worse, and thank goodness we're dead at the end. It's that actually throughout one's life, one's walk with God strengthens and leads upwards and continues into eternity. You see what I mean? So.
And death is the door to that.
And death is the door. Yeah.
Well, I'm just curious. Does Eastern Orthodox theology have an understanding of the sin against the Holy Ghost?
Yeah, unforgivable sin. I didn't go there in my researches, so I don't know.
Just curious. Yeah. Well, if there are no further questions, then it only remains to say thanks to you.